divided in two parts. The first part on human rights and the second part on the human rights-based approach. So, human rights, what are they? Not see presentation anymore. Okay. So the definition is really simple because they are our rights. They are the rights of all human beings, and we are entitled to them just because we were born. We have human rights because we are humans. So it is our humanity that gives us human rights. What does this mean? That human rights are for people, for individuals, for communities, for groups. It's also important to say that they are for groups because some rights have an individual nature, but some other rights, when we think about minorities or indigenous peoples, are also rights that can be enjoyed collectively by the entire group. So this is important because it leads us to an important differentiation between right holders and duty bearers. This is a terminology that is used in international human rights law, but it's really simple actually. Right holders are the people, the groups, the community, the one that have rights and that enjoy the rights, whereas duty bearers is the state, the organs, the agents of the state, and they are called duty bearers precisely because they bear duties or obligations toward the individuals and the groups. And I've included a picture of a British museum because when museums are state-funded, they are part of the state institution. For example, they can be affiliated to the Ministry of Culture, and so it is considered that they actually represent, that they are part of the state infrastructure. So this is an important differentiation to keep in mind, and we will see it also when we talk about the human rights-based approach that really puts individuals, people at the center, so the right holders are at the center of the approach. And specifically in your work with museums, this is something to keep in mind, not to always put people at the center. Now, if we consider the duty bearers, so the state has an obligation to respect, to protect, and to fulfill human rights for the individuals. So this is what we call the tripartite nature of state obligations. Let's have a look at one by one, starting with respect. So the obligation to respect human rights is an obligation that has a negative nature. It means that the state shouldn't do anything in particular, but it should refrain from interfering with the rights of individuals. So how can this relate, for example, to the context of a museum? You see it, I've included some picture of persons with different type of impairment. So, for example, visual impairment, mobility impairment, hearing impairment, so what we call persons with disabilities. And an example of a violation of the right to respect human rights by a museum could be if the museum, for example, has a sign that says that persons with disabilities are not allowed into the museums. And this, of course, can be for other groups as well. Then let's move to the second obligation. This is the obligation to protect. In this case, it comes to play private citizens, but also private company or the business sector. Why? Because the obligation to protect means that the state should take every step to ensure that the individuals within their jurisdiction do not suffer from human rights violations that are carried out by third parties. And why is this? Because the state is responsible for actually creating an environment where human rights can be enjoyed. So if a private actor, like a company, a business, but also like a private citizens, undertake some actions that goes against human rights, then the state is responsible. And this is also, for example, something that is really very relevant when we talk about femicide or different type of homicide carried out, for example, against women, because the state has an obligation to still ensure justice, for example, that the perpetrator is brought to accountability, that there is accountability for the debt. So I try to think of an example in relationship to the work in museums, and I thought about this. Let's imagine that the museum accepts some funding from a private company. I don't know if this is actually the case, but let's imagine that it is. So a museum accepts some funding from a private business or private company to organize an art exhibition. But the company puts one condition, and the condition is that refugees are not welcome to visit this exhibition. So if a museum doesn't do anything about it and is just accept this, maybe to receive the funding, then this would be a violation of the right to protect, of the obligation to protect the human rights of people. And then we move to the third type of state obligation. This is more a positive one, and it is the obligation to fulfill. Why? Because this is actually something that requires the allocation of resources. Most of the time, the obligation to fulfill is not really for free, but it requires the state to have some money or some other type of technical expertise, for example, because it means that the state should take some positive steps to ensure a greater level of enjoyment of rights by adopting law, policies, programs, and especially by allocating the necessary resources. So how does this relate to museums? Well, I made two examples here for pictures. One is maybe for groups that are of a low socioeconomic status, to try to have 3 days free admission to museums, or some discounts, some reduction for particular groups or on particular days. And I know that this is something that in many countries is being done by museums cards, by different initiatives to encourage people to go to the museum. But also, if we think about, for example, persons with visual impairment, like blind people, a way would be to have some measure to ensure that the exhibition or like the different cultural heritage can be accessible for these people as well. So, for example, through the Braille alphabet. And in the same case, we can think about for deaf people, that would be through a sign language interpreter. So all these are examples of the obligation to fulfill. Now, we also have to keep in mind that some of the obligations for the state are immediate, but not all of them. In some cases, we talk about obligation of progressive realization. So let's have a look. What is immediate? What is immediate is the obligation to not discriminate. So this is really a basic principle in international human rights law, the principle of equality and non-discrimination. So no one should be discriminated in the enjoyment of their human rights. And so states don't really need any particular resources to not discriminate. But also they don't need particular resources to just ensure a minimum and basic level of enjoyment of human rights. So I also try to provide an example in the context of the work of the museums, and this would be an example of immediate obligation would be for the museum to not discriminate against any group in accessing the museum. And when I mention any group, I refer again to persons with disabilities, to ethnic or linguistic minorities, to refugees, asylum seekers, migrants, or people living in rural area, or persons of different gender identities, like non-binary people, and so on. And then instead we have the obligation of progressive realization of human rights. This is, of course, a little bit more difficult, just in the sense that often it doesn't come for free, but it needs for the state to allocate some funds, to have some technical expertise, and to implement and adopt specific measures. And in the context of the work of the museums, so it comes back to what I was saying before about the obligation to fulfill human rights, because it would require, for example, museums to progressively allocate resources, maybe also in partnership with some organization, to produce information and communication material for persons with disabilities, like in Braille, or to offer sign language interpretation for persons who have a hearing impairment, but also in case of education for sustainable development interventions, to offer it in minority languages. Now, let's go back to human rights. They are many, but traditionally we always hear the categorization between civil and political rights on the one hand, and then economic, social, and cultural rights on the other hand. In this case, the right that is at the core of Towched project is the right to education. So we're going to focus on this specific right. And it is a right that is guaranteed by most of the international human rights treaties. First of all, by the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. This is not a treaty, but it has acquired the value of customary law. And by this article, it's Article 26. And also by Article 13 and also 14 of the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. This is a human rights treaty, and actually it's one of the first treaties that was adopted by the United Nations General Assembly in 1966. And so these are, let's say, when we need to know what is the right to education about, we generally turn to Article 13 of the Covenant. But I also want to say that there are many other provisions in our treaties. So, for example, we have a treaty specifically for children, one for women, one for migrants, one for persons with disabilities. So we will find normative standards and the provision on the right to education in all these human rights treaties. So the right to education includes all types of education. It can be public, it can be private, but also something that is relevant to Towched project. It doesn't only have to be formal education, that is the education provided through the school system, but it can also be non-formal and informal education, that is also what we call lifelong learning. And so for the scope of Towched project, where we work with education for sustainable development, this education can be provided as formal education, as informal education, but what is important to know is that it is included in the right to education. This is something very important, and actually I will invite you to reflect on this aspect later as well. This is a triple AQ framework. So this is a framework that actually was developed by the committee that monitors the implementation of the treaty, because this is a way in which the states are able to measure as well how well they are doing in guaranteeing the right to education. So there are 4 different elements of the right to education, but you can remember, I hope you will remember this triple AQ framework, because actually it doesn't really relate only to the right to education, but it relates to the right to food, the right to housing, the right to water, to sanitation, to pretty much all economic, social, and cultural rights. And so what is it about? So you will see there are 3 A's and 1 Q. The first A is about availability. So if we relate this to the right to education, it means that educational institutions, facilities, but also teachers and teaching materials should be available in a sufficient quantity. So this is really about the quantity, and that has to be sufficient as well. Accessibility, this is something very important, and it also actually has some sub-dimensions. The first sub-dimension of accessibility is physical or geographical accessibility. Why? Because, for example, I don't know, let's say you are a museum, like, are you accessible to persons that live in rural areas, for example? Or if we think about conflict-affected situations, there are some areas that maybe are hard to reach. Are museums or cultural institutions available in these cases? And then also something that relates to this, and something that affected all of us, actually, if we think about COVID. During COVID, there was distance learning. So in this case, maybe if your museum offered some distance learning, was this learning accessible to all? Because we know that sometimes there is this technological divide and some particular people don't have access to technology, to a computer or to internet. And so in this case, we cannot really talk about true accessibility because they wouldn't be able to connect online. Then we have the economic accessibility that actually it's called affordability as well as a synonym. And this means that all the different groups, like especially those that have a lower socioeconomic background, are able to access the museums and the right to enjoy an educational activity in the museum. And again, as I was mentioning before, I know that there are a lot of great initiatives all around Europe about culture cards, about free entrance on specific days of the week, or for specific group as well as an incentive to encourage kids and youth to go to the museum. And then we can talk about non-discrimination as well. This is also part of accessibility because for a museum to truly be accessible, or for an educational activity in the museum to truly be accessible, all the groups in society need to be able to go, actually. So they shouldn't be discriminated, or they shouldn't suffer any stigma because maybe they belong to an ethnic minorities against which there is some hate speech, for example, or some harassment in the community. So this is something to really keep in mind. And then let's move to the third element, that's acceptability. So this is actually relates to the cultural aspect of like cultural appropriateness, cultural acceptability. Not just in the content of the learning, but also in the methods of the learning. And because we live in societies that are more and more diverse, if we think about Europe, it's important to ensure that we offer educational activities in museums that are also acceptable, where the culture of the minorities also feel reflected. Otherwise, that would lead more to more segregation also in education. So it's important to really take into account the wide range of the different views and the different culture. And this is also because if we consider the rights to culture and cultural rights in general, it's not just about enjoying our own culture, but also being able to enjoy the other people culture and to benefit from the cultural diversity that's existing in society. And finally, the last element is quality. Quality, of course, requires knowledge, requires training, because if we want to offer something like an educational program that is a good quality, we need to know. So if we think about educations for sustainable development goals, it means that the staff and the trainers need to have the required knowledge and the skills to actually implement an effective program or intervention. Yes, so we've seen these 4 elements, and I think this wraps up the first part. I will go now to the second part of the presentation on the human rights-based approach. This is also what we refer to as HRBA. If we need to define it, we can just say that it's a working methodology or a normative framework. You can call it as you wish. But what's important is that you can apply it. Actually, you are encouraged to apply this framework across all the phases of your work. When you plan, when you design an intervention, when you implement it, but also when you monitor and when you evaluate it. And it really puts people like the rights holder at the center. So in general, the rights holder are empowered to know and to claim their rights. But the duty bearers are also empowered to be able to actually respect and protect their obligation in relationship to human rights. So here are some of the key elements of a human rights-based approach. And I want to link these elements concretely to your work in museums, and specifically for Towched to education for sustainable development activities. All the activities should seek to realize human rights. So when you plan and you design an activity, you should know what human rights you are trying to anchor the activity into. It can be cultural right, it can be the right to education, but in general, it's always good to refer to the international human rights framework. Then all the activities should be grounded in a context or situational analysis. This is also very important because the activities should not be planned in isolation from reality, but actually they should be closely connected to the community, to the needs, the problems, the aspiration. So doing a situational analysis is very important. And I also want to mention in this regard that we are preparing as part of Towched project a kit. It's called the Human Rights-Based Approach Toolkit. And the kit actually includes a very, let's say, exhaustive part of the kit is about the situational analysis. So how can you carry it out in a way that will help you then to design an effective intervention. Then another element of the human rights-based approach is considering the individual as active agents and not as passive recipients. So when you organize an activity, it's really good to consult with different groups, to ask them what they want, what are their interests, their activities, and then to empower them, for example, to co-create the activity together. Because in this way, you're giving people ownership and they're not just passive recipients, which sometimes is also what happened maybe in school when kids go to the museums and they're just looking at an exhibition, but they don't really do anything. And then in the human rights-based approach, the process is equally important as a result. So you should evaluate both, because the process is really about empowering the people and the right holders. And lastly, something that is very important also when we talk about inclusive environment is to always try to think who are the most excluded, marginalized, disadvantaged groups in my community. How can I actually try to invite them to participate? How can I empower them? Because in this way, you will really seek to address inequalities and discrimination and give meaning to the principle of leaving no one behind. Just to conclude, how can you actually apply the human rights-based approach? I want to offer 4 tips. Of course, this is very superficial, then we will need to talk about this more and we will give you practical tips on this. But just very briefly, as I mentioned, the first would be to carry out a situational analysis to identify the problem that you want to address for your activity. The second tip is to adopt the human rights compliant terminology. And I really want to focus on this because fostering acceptance and promoting inclusivity passes through using the correct terminology. So often we still hear disabled persons, but actually disabled person is not a correct terminology because it's very victimizing, and we need to say persons with disabilities, because people are not their disabilities, so we cannot call them disabled persons. Or the fact that maybe sometimes we say elderly, but actually in international human rights law, the correct terminology is older person. So I shared with you a link of this terminology guide that was produced by the UN Human Rights Office. It's very useful resources also because it's divided in different chapters. And each chapter has a language to refer to a specific groups, also with regard to gender. And introduce the correct terminology to refer to people of different genders or binary persons. So I invite you to have a look and to also raise awareness on this with your colleagues and with other people in your museums. And then the third way in which you can apply the human rights-based approach is by collecting data when you organize activities. So, for example, if you organize an education for sustainable development activity, do you usually collect disaggregated data to be able to know how many children from a minority group were present, how many children from maybe that are asylum seekers or refugees or migrants, or what is the age of the participants, what is the gender. This is very important because if we don't have disaggregated data, we don't really have the evidence that we need to design and implement successful, culturally appropriate and relevant activities. Because only if we collect and we analyze disaggregated data, we're able to really truly see where the inequalities lie. So this is really also an invitation to think about collecting and analyzing disaggregated data. And I've included the link to this toolkit that includes the 6 principles of a human rights-based approach to data. And you can take a look also to understand more how you can collect this data. And lastly, for the human rights-based approach, a precondition is that you really ensure inclusivity of all groups in your activities. So as we've seen before, there can be many barriers that can prevent different groups from accessing an activity. They can be physical barrier, environmental barrier, but also barriers of communication, or barriers due to the existing stigma, prejudice against specific groups in society. So it's important to map all the existing barriers and to ensure that the learning that you offer is aligned with all human rights principles, and not just the content of the learning, but also the environment in which the learning takes place. And the idea of consulting with vulnerable groups or their representatives is always the best way to actually achieve this. We will share the presentation, and at the end, I put a series of resources that you can also use, or where you can just learn more. Thank you very much. I will stop sharing this screen. But I just want to mention, to conclude, that this session was a part of a Towched training series that we are carrying out during the pilot phase. And so you can follow us and put a like on the video that will be on YouTube if you like it, so you can also receive some more updates in the future. Thank you. I will leave now.